Okay. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining us today for our second webinar of Carey Wallace's four-part webinar series. I apologize that we had to cancel last week's webinar due to the weather. I hope everyone stayed safe, but that webinar has been rescheduled for October 3rd. So please join us for that. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type them into the chat and we will share those with Carey to answer at the appropriate time. Unfortunately, the webinar today is not approved for CE credit, so there will be no QR code to scan this time. I'm sure you all know Carey by now, but if you couldn't make it to the last webinar or you aren't familiar with her, she's the founder of Agency Focus, a consulting company whose mission is to help grow your agency. She's passionate about helping independent agents understand their value and make informed decisions for their agency, which is exactly what she will be doing today. So today's session will dive into smart compensation strategies that will keep your producers motivated, performing, and loyal to your agency for the long haul. So without further ado, Carey, let's get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me and for rescheduling. I too agree. Many of our clients are in Louisiana, and we were thinking about all of you last week. So I'm glad to hear that you all fared well, and hope that your customers also fared well. I know that everybody on this call is probably inundated, so I appreciate you joining us today. This is a topic that is one of the most frequently asked about whenever we work with an independent insurance agent. There's lots of people that have compensation structures that may or may not be 100% in line with what the industry average is. And the reality is, inside your agency, your people are your largest asset. They're also your largest expense. So from a valuation standpoint, if your compensation structure is off or not in line with the industry average, it can be difficult for you to invest in other areas of your agency. That's the first challenge. The second challenge is if it's not in line with the industry average and you're looking to transition ownership, acquire another agency, sell externally, it could actually be a hindrance in that process, because if your potential buyer or the agency you're merging with has a compensation structure that's so vastly different and you're trying to blend those together, it can become a stumbling block in that merger, in that acquisition, or in that exit, because again, your people are your most valuable. And if you start to change their compensation structure during a transition, you run the risk of losing people, losing retention, and therefore having the value of the agency decline if there's an added risk related to potential loss of people. The other thing is well known is in this current market, after COVID, the Great Resignation, a lot of remote work. Before COVID, finding and retaining good talent was number one or number two on every single survey that the Big I Agency Universe did since I've joined the industry since 2000, for the last 16 years. It still remains. In fact, 41% of independent agents say the number one challenge inside their agency is finding and keeping employees, and another 29% expressed finding and keeping producers specifically was one of their number one challenges. So people, access to markets, and the hard market are the ones that remain at the top of the list in that survey. So getting your compensation right is incredibly important in part of that finding and attracting talent, but it's not the only factor. And I don't want to have this all be about money, because the reality is when you look at what it takes to attract new talent, this is a survey that was done, and it's actually focused on millennials, and they ranked in order what was most important to them. And you can see overall compensation ranked number 7. not number one. So the opportunity to learn and grow, the culture, being able to make a difference, having a pathway, an opportunity for advancement remain above the actual compensation. So when we're thinking about creating an environment that you want to attract talent to, it's not just compensation. That's what we're going to focus on today. But you've got to really think about, as an organization, what is my comp structure meant to do? And am I being competitive in all those areas? And am I also highlighting the things about my agency that meet the other needs of an agent or of a potential employee? So I want to attract people. I want to motivate them to do the same, to do the key parts of their role. I want to make sure that I have a retention built into my comp structure. And I also want to be able to reward my high performing employees. So you definitely need to think about these as you're contemplating what that compensation structure is and philosophy is for your agency. I also want to talk about philosophy again, just for a brief moment, because not all agencies are created equal. And, not all agencies even talk about what a producer is in the same way. So, for instance, you might be an agency that has an incredible lead source where no one's actually outbound prospecting. They are responding to the leads that are attracted to your agency. Their comp structure is going to be different than someone who is creating their own lead sources, their own referral partners, doing cold call. You have to be sure you know what what we're talking about, because one is truly account management and the other is production. And when you think about it, what is the culture of my agency? Am I creating an environment where people are expected to be high performers? Am I leading the market in my comp structure and also expecting my team to work at the top performer? Or am I creating a work-life balance where I might be lagging the market in expectations, and my comp structure reflects that it is a flexible place? You can work remote. You have unlimited, PTO, like those kinds of things. Your comp structure will match your culture, because if you attract super high performers to your agency and they're surrounded by others that really value work-life balance and maybe aren't working, 70 hours a week, you're going to change the culture inside your agency. You've got to be honest about what kind of structure are we trying to build, or what kind of culture are we trying to build, and make sure your comp structure matches that, if that makes sense. So are you matching the market? Are you lagging the market? Are you leading the market in your comp structure? And how does it match with your overall culture? The other things to consider before we actually get into the nuts and bolts of compensation is, what is the company's financial position? What's your size? The part of the country you're in. I'm going to give you some benchmarks, but you've got to take it with a grain of salt. These benchmarks are countrywide, not necessarily Louisiana specific. So, if you are in a state where your premiums are higher than the average area inside the country, so therefore your compensation and your average size account is going to be larger just because of the risk inside your market than it would be in the middle of Kansas. So you have to think about what that looks like and take it with a grain of salt when you think about compensation. I'm not talking about cost of living, but from an insurance standpoint, your policies will be greater than those that are not in the same risk area. And honestly, in Louisiana, coastal will be very different than something that's non-coastal. So you have to think about that and really think about how you would adjust some of these things based on your agency's situation. So, and what's the overall difficulty in finding people in your area? You might need to get more competitive because you're in a smaller town and there's not a lot of people to choose from, or you don't offer remote work and you've got to compete with those that do. So it really you have to think about what you're competing with and build your comp structure around that. Your comp structure is definitely your base pay, your bonus opportunity, for a producer, what is the validation schedule that you're going to put in place? And do you have enough data to build a validation schedule, which is how much production are you needed in order to get to a commission only structure, typically over a 3-year period? And are you able to project what an average producer is able to bill or able to book inside your agency with your current lead sources? Or how are you going about building those lead sources? So the more data you have to support that validation schedule, the more successful your producer is going to be, and the more confident they're going to be that they can execute on that validation schedule. Really important, if an agency utilizes Agency Zoom and they've got sales data in order to support a validation schedule, it's far more likely that a producer is going to be successful. If you don't have that data, it might be very difficult to build that and set realistic expectations. And then what are the learning opportunities you're going to create? What is the review process, and is there succession planning in place? Is there a pathway for anyone on your team to move and advance within your organization and eventually potentially be considered for minority ownership? We're going to talk about a lot of different ways you can have retention clauses in someone's compensation if they rise to the level of that kind of contributor inside your agency. Then what are the benefits that you offer? And then think about the environment they're in. Do you have technology that helps them be successful in their role? Is there technology that says, if they're in a role where retention is part of the measurement, do we know which customers are at risk of leaving? The more you can give them in order to be successful, the more attractive it is to come to your agency versus another agency that may not have that kind of those kinds of tools in place. So remember, compensation's one piece of really addressing that. How do we attract and keep great talent? So from a financial standpoint, I said that your people are your largest asset and also your largest expense. So from a total compensation as a percentage of revenue, on the low side, agents are spending somewhere between 47 and 47.6% of their total revenue goes to pay for their people, all the way up to about 56, 57% on average. These are well-performing agencies. In some cases, it can be up over 70%. That's when your comp structure is not in line with the industry average. But this is the range based on the size of your agency, what compensation structure, what the actual payroll and benefits amount of your resources and on your P&L. So what percentage of your total revenue should go to your people is in this range when it comes to best practices agencies. So in order to maintain your profitability and invest in growth, you've got to think about, I have this total bucket of payroll, and how should I allocate that inside my agency for those that are the principal, those that are the producers, my service, and the administrative roles. The reality is many of these people might wear multiple hats. So you could have a producing principal, you could have an administrative person who also does some service work. There's plenty of blends. I will tell you the blend that is the most dangerous for an agency to impact their ability to grow is when a producer is also servicing. Because if you want someone to truly generate green new business and they're also maintaining the book that they're on, eventually their time will be taken over by maintaining the book and will have less and less time to produce. So again, this gives you an idea of that 46 to 56% of your total revenue that goes to people. It's typically allocated like this says on the bottom of the screen, where the principal makes roughly about 18 to 20%, producers make somewhere between 42 and 44% of the total. Your service people make somewhere between 21 and 25%, and the administrative staff makes somewhere around 13% when you look and you stratify all those roles. This moves and shifts. Smaller agencies, the percentages are going to look different. Larger agencies, so this is on average for somewhere between a $750 and $1 million agency as the guide, just so you're aware. So the other factors to consider when you're thinking about what total amount of my revenue should I be allocating to my expense of people. If you're outsourcing services, your allocation should be less than an agency that's not. If you're utilizing a service center, again, you should have less people to service if you have an expense of a service center. If you're utilizing virtual assistants, again, your capacity and number of service people or producers, if the VA is helping with preparing things to create capacity for your producers or your service people, you might have more headcount, but less actual costs in your payroll because your virtual assistants are going to be in an outsourced services or 1099 bucket. So think about that. Any role inside your agency that is being paid either as a 1099 or as a different cost outside your payroll should change the amount you're allocating in that category. So for an agency that's not outsourcing anything, those are the metrics. If you're outsourcing several of these things, you'd actually be less than those metrics. Let's talk about what you mean by a producer. I talked about that a little bit, but when we get agencies that send us their information to do their valuation, we ask for a current list of your staff, their title, and their comp structure. So we've been able to benchmark many of our agent. We do about 250 valuations a year. We've been doing it for about 3.5 years. So we've got quite a database of aggregated, anonymized data that says what does a producer make. But what's really interesting is when we get that information back from agents, these are all the titles that are listed for the people on their staff. They have clear producers, they've got account managers, they've got inside sales, client CSR, a processor, a renewal specialist, a sales specialist. So everybody has a different definition of what they mean. What I mean by a producer is someone who's responsible for generating new business inside the agency and is compensated on a commission structure based on their production. So that is what I'm going to focus on. So the common types of producer compensation structures that we see are there is base only, where they're just getting a flat fee, a base salary, no commission. Commission only, where they validated and now they're completely being paid on their new commission and renewal commission on their book, or there's a base plus commission. The base plus commission is typically for those producers that have not yet validated or have straddled or hybrid roles. What's interesting is we looked at the agencies that are growing and compared their comp structures to those agencies. And you can see the ones that have commission only are the agencies that have the highest growth rates. Those that are fastest growing, 50% of their producers were commission only, 23% were base only, and 27 had a blend. But for the heavy growth that are over 18% growth, 82% of their producers were paid commission only, and less 12% were actually base only. And we've eliminated owners that are producers in this calculation. So the slowest or the flattest are 60% of the people that they said were producers made base only. So you can see if your comp structure doesn't incent what you want someone to do, it could actually hurt their production and the overall growth of the agency. So just keep that in mind, that the performance follows the comp structure without question. So this is something that I'm asked all the time. What are the comp structures that are most common? This is our data as well as best practices data and growth and performance standard data combined. So for commercial producers, their new business commission structure ranges from 39% to 52% of all the data that we have, with it being heavily in the 40 to 45 range. I'll tell you what the average is when we get to the next page. And the personal lines is 38 to 42 in new business, 29 to 42 in commercial for renewal, and 22 to 30 in renewal commission for personal lines. Both also indicate that there's a minimum threshold. So as a producer's book gets large enough, really agencies that have separated their sales and service very well create house accounts, and there's a minimum threshold where the producer no longer gets paid on the accounts that are below the minimum threshold, with the thought process being we want to continue to keep them involved in the relationships that are important, but we want the account manager or the CSR to do the work on the smaller accounts so they have the capacity to continue to sell. So that stratification and movement of house accounts is incredibly important. The minimum threshold on the new business commission is $2,500. The minimum threshold on personal lines accounts is $1,000. Again, this will vary in sizes in parts of the country. So take that with a grain of salt. Again, the Kansas commission thresholds might be different than, or account thresholds will be different than the ones that are in California or Florida. So please remember, I got to talk about the averages across the country. So the average commercial lines overview is the most common comp structure is 45 new, 30 renewal, with the average new business generated of 87 to 162K in revenue, and the average book serviced is somewhere between 230 and 1.3 million. Again, this is looking across all sizes of agencies. That is what the commercial lines book looks like. Personal lines per producer is 40 new, 30 renewal. That number of that renewal is actually more like 25% this year, just so you're aware. And the average new business is 30 to 80K per producer, and the average book service is 185 to 650 for a personal lines only. Someone's going to ask me, what about a blended that writes personal lines and commercial lines? It really depends on what that mix of business would be. The easiest way is to show you. So someone's just asking me, do they write personal lines and commercial lines with an average new business? It's tough for me to say that because I really don't know what concentration you're talking about. If they're truly 50-50, you would have to change these calculations to figure out what their production should look like. But giving you the pure, you would then be able to say, what's the average size account that my producer goes after in personal lines and commercial lines? How many accounts do they typically write? Therefore, this is the average that happens and what the expectation is inside that agency, if that makes sense. So these are guides if they are pure and clean, true. But if you go back to your average size account of what your personal lines focused producers are doing versus your commercial lines, you can get to what is your average and what is your expectation inside your agency, inside your market. Hopefully I answered your question, Chris. So here's what I'll also tell you. There's a lot of online Facebook groups and all those things where people want to say, hey, what is your commission structure? And they're typically some of the most fruitful. Like there's a lot of posts about it, but this one is asking, this is actually out of Insurance Soup. So I asked their permission to use as an example. Lots of agents go on and post and say, hey, I'm thinking about hiring someone. Does 80% new business and 35 renewal commission sound fair for 100 commission, no salary insurance producer? What do you think? Well, this is why people come and get their agencies valued, and they put this kind of comp structure in because they didn't want to use a validation schedule where it's base plus commission to start. They start with an 80-30 or 70-50. And it's because the producer doesn't have enough, it doesn't have anything yet. He's coming with absolutely nothing. So you want that producer to be able to live. And therefore you give this high and new and high end renewal. The problem is it's really tough to walk back from that once they have built up a book of business. So I strongly recommend, number one, don't listen to this. This is not industry average. I just showed you that industry average is the 40-30 or 45-30 for commercial. And if you tried to sell your agency and your producers were making 80 new and 35 renewal, they're never, no buyer is going to want to continue to pay that because it won't be commiserate with what the rest of the staff is. The better thing to do is figure out what your average size accounts are, how many accounts they could reasonably write, and put a 45-30 for a commercial lines, and then figure out the base that you would need to pay them until they validate and get them there within the first 3 years. By doing this process, you as an owner know what your cash outlay is for the new producer. The producer knows exactly what they need to do in order to earn what is expected of them, and you're able to manage their progress through that process. If you get 6 months in and they're nowhere near the production, they're going to know I'm not going to make what I need to make. You're going to know they're not able to produce or not able, and you might be able to mitigate it, but you also could cut your losses on someone that isn't going to make it versus someone who's making a comp structure of 80 new and 35 renewal. It might be masked for a period of time, but long term, it does not set you up for success to put that kind of comp structure in place. So this is a free tool that you can download on our website to actually walk you through what numbers you need to know. You need to know the average size account, what the average commission is for your agency. So it asks for average size premium account, what your average commission to the agency is, how many accounts on average your producers write, and therefore what would the agent be able to make in the first year if they followed that same production in order to come up with your own validation schedule. This is one of the most common things that our team helps agents with beyond valuation, perpetuation planning, and fractional CFO work. Like, this is the most common additional consulting that an agent asks for. So, and here again, this is what the things they're gonna ask you for. So if the new business goal is $30,000, the target average size account is 500. We'll know that we'll be able to tell them, here's the number of new accounts that would be required, and you can start back. So if you need 60 new accounts in order to make this happen, you can say that would require you to make 15 weekly contacts. If your contacts per appointment ratio is 33%, that means you would have 5 appointments a week. You'd need 20 appointments in order to get here. So your annual appointments needed is 240. If you have an appointment to proposal is a 50% close ratio, you'd need to generate 120 proposals in order to hit these 50% closing ratio from proposal to account. So again, the more data you have about what your process looks like and what your close ratios are, the more likely you can put a plan together to say, hey, listen, this is a proven thing. If you get 15 weekly contacts a week, on average, you're going to be able to hit the goal. And if not, if you're only averaging 9 a week, you'll never be able to get to what your goals are. So being able to put it in measurable terms, not just dollar amounts, allows you to manage that process different. That is one of the parts of the producer planning tool. And this actually shows you, great. So if they get those 60 new accounts, we give them a base of 35. The new commission that they will make on a 45-30 commission structure, their comp for the first year will be estimated around 48.5. Next year, when they've got the retention at 95% of their book, their base will drop to 25%. Their new business goes up to 80 new accounts because they've got some seasoning, and now they can make 51,000 projected for the year. Third year, the base goes to 15. The renewal amount starts to go up because the book is growing, and by year 4 there is no base, and they're able to start their trajectory on a commission only structure. This changes based on where you are and what the average cost of living is, all those good things. But you can see, if you write this and you get to what the average accounts are and the average amount that it means for the agency, as well as what it means for the producer, now we've got a plan that we can manage to, and we're not doing something crazy like 70 new or 80 new. This is incredibly helpful, and it's the tool that we use to help agents build the plan that makes sense for them. So what happens when you have an agent that is either being compensated crazy or has never done the house accounts? They've never actually taken their book and said, hey, listen, we're going to add an account manager to help you. Your book has grown to a certain amount. How do we actually give you some help? This is an example of how to move from one, for a producer that's doing, 40-30, but they're getting 30% on their entire book. So I have an agent right now that I'm working with that his producer has a massive book, been with the agency for about 7 years. They need 2 people to help him, but in essence, the agency is paying him 40-30, plus they've hired 2 other people to work his book, which is incredibly important, but the profitability of the agency is suffering because in essence, they're duplicating their compensation for that book pretty significantly. So we took that producer's book of business and said, what are the accounts that it's incredibly essential that the producer stay involved? That typically is your top 20% of the accounts represent 80% of the revenue, typically, especially if it's a commercial lines producer. But in this case, for the agent that I did this analysis for this week, it ended up being 70-30. So 70% of his accounts only represented 30% of the revenue. And if we moved some of those to house accounts and had him only focus on the ones that are the highest volume accounts, they're the most, fragile relationships, or they're the most complicated accounts, and move the others to house accounts, it allowed him to have time to generate new business at a higher commission rate, take away the ones that are at the lower retention rate, and in essence, he would actually make more money and have more time and capacity to continue to grow this book. The other thing that is really important in this structure is he basically went from having 400 accounts that he covered to 220 accounts, and his gross commission potential went from 300 to 460. So you have to actually think, and we did this over time. This was not like an overnight thing. This is a plan. We are going to transition these accounts and allow the book to become house accounts, give you that service, create that capacity for new business. And for them, they hated this. They don't get a lot of joy from the service work. They like actually the hunt and to produce. So the producer in this case was very much on board with this, as long as they could see, okay, if I have capacity, I'll be able to get some bigger deals and spend the time I need in order to work those deals rather than being pulled into the service work on my account. So in this situation, he went from 300 to 460, and the difference was 53% in the revenue growth. The average size account, so the average size account in his book went from 750 in revenue to 2,100 in revenue because he had the ability to focus on writing some larger accounts. His number of accounts went from 400 to 220, and the agency savings on the commission for the offloaded accounts was only 15K in commissions. So you have to do the math on the book of business to be able to stratify an account and create a small business unit or house accounts in order to make this work. But the calculation and the process is exactly the same as I just described. You look at the whole book of business, determine what are the most high, profile accounts that the producer needs to be in, and create a pathway to say, hey, listen, if we're going to give you back a certain amount of your time, it's reasonable to expect that your production would go up. Therefore, if you're able to do that, your compensation should actually grow, not decline. So it has to be a win-win, but it is a process. And if you have this in place and you do your house accounts every single year, it becomes an incredibly healthy situation. So I know that is a complicated thing, but it is a really important thing to make sure you know about. So the last thing not the last, but one of the things I want to talk about is the structure of your producer, whether or not they are a 1099 employee or they are a W-2 employee, whether they own their book of business or the agency owns the book of business. All of these things actually, again, can create challenges inside an agency for the transferability of your book of business. So there's very common to have 1099 producers inside your agency. Oftentimes, those are long-term relationships. They've been there for forever. By the time an agent comes to me and says, hey, I'd like you to value my book, I hear those are handshake agreements and it's vague who owns the book of business. Or if they own part of the book of business, they own 20% and the agency owns 80%. It is really difficult to pull that apart and figure that out. And the reality is, if an agency owner wants to sell their agency, they have to own what they sell. So if there's any ambiguity in a book of business, a buyer is going to want that to be clear, crystal clear, because they need to know what they're buying. So number one, you should have contracts in place with everyone on who owns the book of business, who owns the renewals, and that there is a non-solicit and non-piracy clause in your contract. A 1099 by definition from the IRS is someone that can work in multiple places and is self-directed. So I actually have this. I never do this, but I'm giving you these slides so you can refer back to it. But this is literally how it is defined by the IRS. So a W-2 employee, they have the right to direct the work being performed. And if they're an independent contractor, they can provide similar services to other businesses. If you have the right to control their behavior, their financial, or their relationships, they're basically saying it's not a 1099 relationship. The tricky part about what we do is your producers could not produce without your carrier appointments. So a 1099 relationship is actually putting you a little bit at risk, unless it's true that they're producing for other agencies. The IRS could come back and say that's really a W-2 and you didn't pay payroll taxes on that. I am not a lawyer, but I'm just saying it is an exposure that you should be aware of and actually make sure that they meet the test of what a 1099 is. Number two, be clear on who owns the book of business. And if at all possible, if you have agents that own a portion of their book, transitioning it from book ownership to a very small minority of the agency ownership keeps the book with the agency. And here's what I mean by that. So if I have two producers and one doesn't own their book and the other one owns their book 100%, and I want to sell my agency, or I want to transition my ownership to my daughter, who is my next leader, if I'm going to sell externally, the buyer wants to know that everything I'm buying, that the owner owns it. So I would have to remove the producer-owned book of business completely from that calculation, or I have to buy back that book from that producer so it is included with the agency. If I'm not able to buy it back, I exclude it, I footnote it in the report, and I exclude all of their compensation, because in essence, that producer will now have to form an agreement with the new owner. And if they still want to access it through that agency, it's no longer the same relationship. But I can't sell it as the current owner because I don't own it. If instead that producer owned a percentage of the agency that is calculated based on the size of their book and recalculated as their book grows and the agency grows as a percentage of the total, that with a cap. So let's say their book makes up a total of 2.5% of the agency, and they can never have more than 3% ownership in the agency. That is perfectly fine. When we sell the agency, they would get 2.5% of the proceeds of the sale, but the book would stay intact because it is part of the whole. This gets really tricky when a producer-owned book of business actually has a large footprint inside one of your large carriers where contingencies are part of that calculation. So if you need to remove a producer-owned book of business that now changes your contingencies with your carriers, it's a ripple effect of the profitability of your agency, and it weakens the agency or strengthens it. Like, what if that book has a super high loss ratio that's owned by the producer and the agency as a whole doesn't? It could actually go the opposite way. But my point is, it makes it complicated, it slows it down, and it is something that has to be cleaned up if you're ever thinking about an exit. So do you find that the accounts that are moved to the house accounts remain with the agency or move? I actually think they get more attention when they're moved to a house account than they typically got from the producer, because those are small accounts that the producer has no longer has time for, but that person's still available if something massive happens. We actually found that the retention on those house accounts went up, not down. So in most cases, they're getting more touches and more love, if you will, by becoming house accounts and having an account manager focus on it, and also be bonused on account rounding that account and being responsive on those accounts. So remember, these are your smaller accounts that maybe aren't getting the attention of the producer, especially if they're a commercial lines producer. So the other thing is to think about is key people, whether they're administrative people, service people, producer. If you want them to stay with the agency, providing a pathway to ownership, even if it's super minority ownership, is a great way to keep them from thinking, maybe I should go start my own agency. You can do that with deferred comp. You can do it with a pathway to actually ownership, or you can do that with phantom stock. So I'm going to briefly talk about what those things look like. But if you think about it, you got to know the people and what's most important to them, what the purpose is of your retention strategy, and what behaviors you're trying to incentivize. So there's an agency that I'm working with. They have a large producer, and basically he said, I want to make sure that he stays with me for the next 15 years. So for him, there is a deferred compensation program in place that says, listen, as your book gets to a certain size, you're now eligible for a deferred comp plan. And if you stay with the agency, you have the ability to have a $100,000 payout on your retirement. It actually is written so if you stay 5 years once you become eligible, you get 33% of what that is. If you stay 10 years, you get 66%. If you stay all the way to the 15 years, you get the full payout. Something like as simple as that, where there's a dollar amount and there's a vesting schedule to incent someone to stay. And that dollar amount needs to be commensurate with the size of the book. So I'm just using an example. For him, it was, I'll pay you 1.25 times your commission when you exit over 3 years, and you invest over this period of time that you stay with the agency. So it's compensation, and therefore that person is incented to stay. Others might look like, I'm going to give you phantom stock, same kind of conversation, but the phantom stock operates and gives maybe potentially a portion of the profitability of the agency year to year, and if the agency sells, would convert to stock in that sale where they would participate in that exit. And then stock is stock. So same thing, you would have the ability to have some profit sharing rights, as well as if the agency sold, you would have a payout or a combination of the three. The reality is not all key people want to be an owner, and not all owners want people having a vote inside their agency. So I am not suggesting every one of these is right for everyone, but putting some kind of incentive plan in place is a great way to retain quality staff and have them participate in the success of the agency. So um, what I found is once we go through this process and talk to the staff members, some of them say, I don't ever want to have a K1. I don't want to be paid on the profitability of the agency and have a tax liability. I also don't want to be impacted if the agency does some acquisitions. So I'd really rather just a deferred comp plan. Others say, no, I would like to have a pathway to ownership. I'd like to be your next successor, and I'd like to start with this pathway to minority ownership and possibly be considered as your successor at some time. So you really got to know where these people are, but not talking about it and not putting something in place, your staff will be thinking, hey, my owner's getting older. I don't know what their plan is. I'm not 100% sure what my place is. Maybe if I grow to a certain size, it might be a good idea for me to start my own agency so I'm not left working for someone I don't want to. Communication around keeping your key people, I think is something we miss on in our industry. And think about it this way. If we were accountants or lawyers, there's always a pathway to partnership in law firms and accounting firms. Think about what that would look like inside an insurance agency. If we had a clear pathway to say, you join, you stay for X amount of time, you produce, and meet these performance metrics, whether you're a producer, whether you're a service person, whether you're an admin person, we have performance metrics in place. If you hit both of those, you now are eligible for some kind of incentive in order to stay with the agency because you are incredibly valued by the agency. I think the more agencies that do this, the stronger their staff will be, and the stronger they'll be in any kind of transition, because those are the key people and relationships you want to keep inside your agency. So I put together a grid of what these incentive plans look like. And honestly, I do a whole presentation just on these, but it's important to make sure you think about what's most important to each of these people. How could you implement it? How do you make sure you protect the agency and also incent, and that it's scalable for your agency? And not all employees will be eligible. Like there are some that just wouldn't be eligible, but creating the reward, the eligibility, the compensation, the way that it vests, the way that it's going to be funded, and the time is incredibly important. And then thinking about, what's the tax implication? What's the secure, all these things, making sure that the recipient understands the ramification of these different structures is also important. So again, I just think it's incredibly important to not just think about what's their compensation now? How do I attract them and bring them to the agency? How do I set them up for success in order to be successful while they're here? And how do I make sure that they want to stay with the agency long term is really what's incredibly important. And, we live in a world where it's not 30 years with an organization, but it could be longer than what some agencies are seeing where people are jumping from job to job. So again, your people are your single biggest asset, and they are the single largest controllable expense. So putting some time into what kind of comp plan do I want to have in place? Do I want to be the one that pays the most and expects the highest performer? Or do I want to create a balanced workplace and maybe have it be a little more flexible with a work-life balance? Do I want to have a pathway to ownership? And do I have things that attract people to come and be successful in my agency? So one of the questions is they want to know the feedback. What about W-2 salaries employees who produce with a bonus structure and or a comp structure? So W-2 salary employees who produce, again, for our knowledge, typically if there's a base pay and a smaller portion is variable that's based on their production, that agency typically will see lower growth numbers than an agency that has commission only. So, and I say that with an asterisk because there's an agent in Ohio that proves me wrong every single time I say that because of the culture that he's built. But it's not bad that you have that, but I think your expectations around someone that's being compensated that way needs to be realistic. Someone who has to produce a certain amount in order to hit a compensation level because their compensation is only based on their production will write more business. Someone who makes a pretty healthy base won't be as incented in order to really, really get those things written. So you need to make, and honestly wouldn't be incentivized because their compensation is capped by this base, right? Like, so a true producer wants to make as much as they can. And as an owner, your answer is you can make as much as you want, depending on how much you produce. So I think it's a balance of what kind of person do you have, what kind of environment are you in, and what comp structure makes the most sense. Hopefully I'm answering your question, Shelby. I'm happy to answer any other questions. Again, this is one of the most asked about topics that we get. I'm happy to talk about there's comp structures that need to be put in place for the service people inside the agency as well. So one of the common questions I ask are, what are the common incentive ways that I see from all the agencies that we look at that our account managers and CSRs are being incented. So typically those roles, account managers and CSRs, are base pay with bonus. Sometimes account managers get commission on the account rounding. So anything green new that they write, they might get one-time commission on the new account rounding and have goals around rounding out the account. So if you think about it, producer has a book of business. We create this house accounts. The account manager is either supporting the producer or just managing those house accounts. Now their goal is to account round and take them from 1.5 policies per customer to 4 policies per customer. They've got goals around that. They can either be paid commission on the new, or they can be paid a transactional. If so many account rounded accounts get a bonus of X number of dollars for a maximum of X for a quarter. For CSRs, it could be the same thing. Are you creating opportunities and leads for the account managers or the producers to have opportunities? Are you asking the account rounding questions? The other one that is very often done is, are you getting Google reviews for the agency? Are you asking the questions? If you've got a great experience through a service, like, have you asked them to provide a Google review? It doesn't just have to be on revenue, but there can be a bonus structure, again, around whatever behavior you want each of those people to be focused on. So, but for both of those roles, their compensation is largely their base pay with some smaller bonus. And typically the producer is much more variable, where their base is in essence their renewal compensation, and their variable pay is their new business. So hopefully that answers the question. Are there any other compensation questions or things that we talked about in here that you'd like to go into deeper? I think I got all of them as they were coming. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, I think we're good. Well, thank you so much for having me and allowing me to come present today. I appreciate it. I look forward to
Awesome.
next week, right?
Yes. Thank you so much, Carrie. That was awesome. So thank you all for attending today. We have two more opportunities to hear from Carey coming up. So on September 25th, we have planning for the eventual transition of your agency. And then on October 3rd, which is the one that is rescheduled from last week, redefining your team, the power of VAs, bots, and automation. And as Carrie mentioned, the slides and recording will be available to everyone after this. I will send you a follow email with all of those documents. And unless there's any further questions, that's all for today. We will see you next time. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you very much.